So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to give a talk today. So there's a good transition between insecticide and pesticides and insects. So in 2015, the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and that was part of the scientific and political agenda for 2030. And they are supposed to address the most fundamental challenges to global sustainability and human development. And as you can see, they are pretty broad. They aim to target no poverty, zero hunger, good health and wellness, and so on. So basically, if you look at these SDGs, they aim to reduce inequalities, to limit the environmental impact of human activities, and to ensure sustainable livelihoods, which is commonly known as the 3 Ps: eradicating poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. So what is the link between SDGs and ecology? One way to look at these SDGs is to look at them independently, boxed next to each other, but you can also look at them in this way, where basically all SDGs connected to the biosphere are at the bottom. Above them, you have all connected to society, and above all, the economy. And this is the completely opposite way of looking at things usually, because usually you think that if you improve the economy of the planet, then you will improve the society and it will benefit the planet. Here, you look at SDGs where the biosphere is at the bottom, and by improving the quality of the biosphere, then you will improve the society, and that will feed the economy. One more example to look at that is that if you fight against global change, and if you try to get some safe water, then you will improve life on Earth and life below water. And these two SDGs, 14 and 15, will allow the benefit for the society to attain food security, for example. And all of this will feed the economy. So what is the link now between SDGs and insects, which is the main model system that we are studying in my institute? For a very long time, insects have been seen as enemies, and I will give you 2 examples of that. The first one is that because insects can feed on many different things, but most of them feed on plants, including crops. And insects actually eat a lot of the food that is produced for humans. And about 25 to 80% of agriculture production is eaten by insects. And what insect eats can feed about 1 billion people. So here you can see that insects are directly connected to the SDG number 2 because they eat our food. Over the years, we had several Le Studium fellows, and one of them, Marion Harris from the US, was very interested in these kind of topics, and she was focusing on insects that are able to take the control of plants, and the insect forced the plants to create a shelter and to provide food to the insects. And she was very interested to study these systems and how we can better understand these systems and improve agriculture by an interdisciplinary approach. Improving and fighting against insects as enemies for agriculture requires also to better understand their physiology. How can they locate their food, for example? How can they find a mate? And sometimes when plants are attacked, they produce volatiles, and these volatiles will attract natural enemies that will kill the insects. So Stephen Foster was very interested by these kind of questions, and very interested in how insects use chemical communication to find their food and to find their mates. And Stephen will come back this September to work on stabilized up methods for insect physiology. So insects as enemies also, second example, because they can kill humans. And the most the main killer are mosquitoes. They actually kill more humans than wars, car accidents, sharks, or crocodiles or snakes, for example. And it's considered that they kill about 800,000 people a year, not themselves, but because very often they transmit viruses or pathogens that are responsible for strong disease. And by fighting against these enemies, you can have a direct impact on SDG number 3, for example. So we had also several Le Studium fellows that were interested in how these disease vector insects can learn and memorize signals from the environment. So Marcelo Lorenzo was interested in these kind of questions. Marcos Horacio Pereira was interested in how insects like kissing bugs and mosquitoes adapt to the hematophagy, which is feeding on blood, because when insects feed on blood, they feed on something that is very warm, hot, and that can be detrimental to the insects. So basically what they do is they just pee at the same time that they eat, and that allows to exchange the heat and to reduce the heat inside the insects and to prevent damages to the physiology of the insects. So insects can be enemies, but they can also be allies. And the most well-known example is all the ecosystem services that insects provide to the ecosystem. And the most example is pollination, for example. So what insects do for the functioning of the ecosystems is estimated to $60 billion a year. And by pollinating plants, they provide food to many of us. Understanding what insects do in the ecosystems requires to study many different aspects. It requires to study what is the population dynamics, how they react to the spread of disease or pathogens, how species can invade a specific environment, but also how all these systems are damaged by anthropogenic environmental changes. So Edward Macaulay was interested in this kind of questions. But it also requires to study how insects adapt to specific environments, how to adapt to global changes, how to adapt to desert environments. And we had several years ago a consortium that was dedicated to these questions. And sometimes it allows us to discover very interesting things, because it is considered that insects basically are everywhere. You can find them in every ecosystems except in the sea. But actually, researchers and at the ERB and Maria Soledad Leonardi, that was Le Studium Fellows this year, discovered that lice can actually attach to seal, and they can actually live in the marine environment, and they can adapt to deep diving into the ocean. So insects can provide ecosystem services. They can also be very good allies against enemies. And this is called the biological control. Here you can see a wasp that is laying eggs into a caterpillar. So you can use this wasp to fight against the caterpillar that is eating your food. So by studying these systems, by understanding these systems, you can provide alternative to pesticides, for example. And then you can reach SDG number 2 and also SDG number 3. Sometimes some of these wasps need to inject viruses into the caterpillars to escape the immune system of the caterpillars, so they can develop inside the caterpillars. And 2 years ago, we had Maria Cristina del Rincon Castro from Mexico that was especially interested by these kind of questions. How can we understand how wasps use viruses to escape the immune system of the host, and can we use that to develop specific tools for sustainable agriculture, for example? So insects can be enemies, insects can be allies, and a new way of looking at this insect is considering that insects can also be solutions. And I will give you one example. This is raising insects for feed and food. Here you can see a black soldier fly, which is a model system that is very mainly used in the industry at the moment. And this fly is very interesting because the larvae of the fly can feed on organic waste that comes from agriculture, for example. And larvae will feed on this organic waste and they will convert it into proteins. So the larvae are very rich in proteins, and you can use this larvae for human food or for animal feed. They can also, by degrading the organic waste, they produce fertilizer that you can use and can re-inject into the system. They also produce different products like fatty acids and bioproducts that are very interesting for the cosmetics, for example. So you can really have a circular economy with a very efficient larvae that are degrading waste and producing high-quality proteins food. And this food can be used in agriculture, in farming for pork and chicken, for example, and they can allow a development of small farming that can conducted, for example, by women. So you can reach SDG about equalities and gender equality, for example. But this needs a continuous dialogue between farmers and educators and also researchers. So by using this larvae, then you can produce fertilizer, then you can reduce the use of chemical compounds, you can recycle organic waste, you can produce food for animal feed and for humans, and you can develop small farmers' activities. So all of this can reduce inequalities, limit the environmental impact of human activities, and ensure sustainable livelihoods by providing food security, fighting against poverty, protecting the planet, and allowing prosperity, peace, and justice. So maybe you have seen in the media that, you know, producing insects for food is like the new thing, but is it really new? Actually not. You can, I mean, first humans already consume insects, and you can see examples of insect consumptions in all ancient civilization. Even in the Middle Age in France, we used to eat insects, but we kind of rediscover that. Currently, there's more than 2,000 species of insects that are consumed in the world, mostly in Asia and in Central and South America, but also in Africa. And the species that is mostly consumed over the world is a silkworm larvae. The mealworm beetle larvae are also very popular, as well as crickets and locusts, and ants, bees, and wasps are considered as delicacies. 2 billion people actually eat regularly insects, but very often it's in very specific geographical areas. In Asia, that's where insect is mostly consumed, but it's pretty common also in some part of South America where they eat ants, locusts, and caterpillars. It's also common in Africa where they consume mostly locusts, crickets, and termites. It's a traditional consumption in Oceania where they consume ants and caterpillars. But in Europe and North America is mostly, you know, for fun, but not so much into the habits. Where do the insects come from? Most of the time they are just collected in the wild, which can be detrimental to the biodiversity in some areas. But you can also have some small farming that develop, for example, here in cricket farming in Thailand. But sometimes you can see they can be collected in various ways in the environment. But now we really have an industrial production, and actually France is a leader, the world leader in the insect production, with many different systems from short production unit, a small production unit, and big industrial units. And what about you? Have you eaten insects? Do you want to eat insects? Actually, all of you already have eaten insects. If you eat figs, for example, you eat insects, because figs are like thousands of small flowers, and to produce a fig, you need the flowers to be pollinated, and this is done by this wasp with a very flat head that can enter the fig. The female will pollinate the flowers, but she will also lay eggs in some of the flowers. So these crispy things in the fig can be baby wasp. But you also consume, each of you consume about 500 grams to 1 kilogram of insect each year without knowing it. It can be in your processed food, in your salads, in your canned soup. But yeah, you don't see it. Why should you eat insects? The first reason for eating insects is because they have a very low ecological impact compared to other production. They require less land, they use less food and way less water. And also most of insects is edible. Compared, about 80% of insects can be consumed, while only 40% of the beef, for example, can be consumed. So by producing insects for food, you can reach SDGs 13 and 6. The second reason is for the nutritional value. I told you that insects are very rich in proteins. You find way more proteins than in beef or chicken. You can find a lot of vitamins and fatty acids. And only 100 grams of insects provide you enough vitamins and minerals each day. So by eating insects, you can reach SDG number 2 and SDG number 3. So now, you only need to work on perception and habits. And this is the reason why now, at the moment, most of the insects are processed. So basically, you will eat insects, but in products where you actually don't see any insects anymore, like here, for example. But now it's time to investigate, new way to use insect as food, like real ingredients, and to experiment, new recipe in different in local dishes or international dishes. So maybe insects will be the next sushis. Here you can see a quiche tourangelle, which has been made out of crickets instead of rayon, and it can be matched with local wine, and it's pretty good. So maybe your greatest fear might actually save the planet, so eat bugs. Thank you.